Okay, so Aristotle starts out with this famous dictum at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, and I put it on the board behind me. Every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good. And it sounds very commonsensical. We're going to talk a little bit about Aristotle and what he actually has to contribute. But that's a very important thing to sort of mull over. Everything that we're involved with involves purposive activity, and we often lose sight of that. So part of what we're going to do tonight is look at the nature of purposive activity, not just a bunch of examples, but at least what one philosopher thinks it consists of. And we will do a lot of trying to apply it to your own life and to your profession. But we're looking at something a bit wider. I wanted to start out actually by using an example. You're all familiar with this, right? This is one of the heroes of culinary arts, Escoffier. And this is what? Some kind of book.
Is that the guide?
Yeah, it's an English translation of the guide. So, and what is the guide?
A whole crazy mess of recipes.
Yeah, it's a cookbook. It's a ton of recipes. When I first read through it, I was expecting, that everyone had talked so much about Escoffier. Well, here I'll actually get his philosophy. I'll get his whole view on things. And no, instead, it's mostly a bunch of recipes. And there are some discussions about why sauces matter, and what should be done first and what should be done last. A cookbook is an artifact, and it's sort of a nexus, a locus of purposive activity. If you want to know how to make something, we can just open this up at random. If you want to make hot eggs for lunch and hors d'oeuvre, well, there it is on page 165, right? And you just follow the recipe, and sometimes they have parts that you have to look up in other places. But it's reduced to technique. And the questions of why you would do things this way, why this matters, why you want to do things in one way rather than another, they're not really answered by this, are they? They're sort of assumed or set to the side. It's interesting. The cookbooks are one of the first kinds of technology that we have that gets called technology. Aristotle actually is the one who coined the word technology. And he didn't coin it to talk about levers or let alone cameras or anything like that. He actually coined it to talk about textbooks. He called the people who wrote books of rhetoric, little arts of rhetoric, basically like cookbooks. If you want to get this sort of reaction from your audience, throw this at them. If you want to provoke this sort of thought process, throw this at them. He called those technologoi, the people who wrote those. And we get our word technology from that. There's a sort of reduction to technique going on in those. And there's something like that going on in this. This book is very important, right? And everybody needs to have a copy, I assume, right? If you don't, then you go to the library and you get one. If you lose one, you find another way to get one of these, even if you've memorized the whole thing, because it's part of your canon. But this book will not tell you what to do as a chef. It won't tell you how to make difficult decisions. It won't broach the bigger things like what career path should I be on, let alone questions like how should I live, or what is a good chef, not just in the sense of somebody who has mastered certain skills, but morally good, or good for other people, or good in certain contexts. This won't give that to you. So you have to turn to something else instead. At the same time, like I said, this is a nexus of a lot of different purposive activity. Why is this book such a classic? Why do they make you read this?
He redefined the way kitchens work in a commercial sense.
Yeah.
And that level of knowledge is important because it's not a guide on how to be a chef, but you can produce, it puts in the right mindset, I guess. It gives you a certain discipline to look at how he wrote things down in his method.
Okay, let's assume that all that is the case. I see no reason why not to. Notice that what you've got there is something that goes beyond the book itself. The book is an object, but it has certain purposes that go beyond it. Something that has to do with transformation of the person. into the chef. That's why everybody should run into this at one time or another, and probably just not run into it, but actually engage with it over the course of their education. Just like if you want to be a philosopher, well, you have to read Aristotle at some time or another. You might leave him aside, but you certainly have to read him at some point. Now, if it's a classic, then one of the things that we're going to look at today is that of excellence. This embodies a certain kind of excellence, right? That's why it's still on the shelves even though it's fairly old. Otherwise, if excellence was simply whatever's the newest thing, we'd throw this out. And Escoffier himself, if he thought that it amounted to that, he'd throw his own book out. But that's not the case. So this embodies a certain kind of excellence. And we're going to look at this notion of excellence, or as Aristotle will call it, virtue, a little bit later on. So I want to give you an overview of where we're going to go with this first. I want to say a few words about philosophy and Aristotle and what we're doing here today. Some of the questions that you gave to Professor Shaka, I want to tackle those at the beginning. Not necessarily giving you full answers to them, but at least sort of mapping out where we're going to go with them. And then what we're going to do is we're going to tackle some of the material in units in a kind of sequence. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to, for each one of these sequences, present a little bit on the text, maybe put a few things on the board, and then we'll think about some examples, and we'll look at some possible applications to your own life, how this actually bears fruit for you. And then we'll do some more sustained Q&A about these. And I want to keep this sort of on track, and you guys are pretty good at that. You know, I know that here at the Culinary, things are supposed to work like clockwork, right? And they always do, don't they?
Absolutely.
Kitchens never get behind.
Or,
Well, sometimes they do, but not as much as most places. So what are we going to talk about? There's 4 topics that I want to hit on. And as you read through this, you might have sort of seen things falling out this way. But they're not necessarily tied to just one section, then the next section, then the next section. The first thing I want to talk about is just purposive activity in general. This notion of doing things for a reason. And that's part of every human action. Everything that we do is done for some sort of reason. So we want to look at that general idea. Then we're going to look at the reason for something bigger, a really philosophical question. What's the purpose of human life in general? So we're going to go from the very specific to big question kind of stuff. Then Aristotle's answer to this involves some reference to what he calls virtues. And we're going to talk about that and actually look at some of the things that you guys wrote for that. What is it called? This, I believe?
yeah, I shared your journal entries in terms of the qualities that make for good chefs so that we could look at those things. So just the list that you did.
So we'll look at just a few of those. We're not going to go over everybody's thing in minute detail because we've got an hour and a half. So we're going to look at a few of those. And then we'll look at the intellectual virtues. And I know you guys have a lot of questions about the connection between making and doing, praxis and poesis. And so we'll try to clarify some of that. And then we'll do, if we have time, we'll do some sort of general Q&A afterwards. So if anybody has any pull everything together questions, we can do that. So a few words about philosophy before we start. There's sort of 2 extremes that we want to avoid that I see tied in with a lot of misconceptions about philosophy itself. Sometimes people, and this comes from our culture, where we often use philosophy in a very loose manner, the term. Somebody will talk about, well, my philosophy of coaching is X, Y, Z, or my philosophy on salads is X, Y, Z. They don't mean philosophy in terms of the academic discipline, then, right? They're not talking about philosophy at the same level that Aristotle is. And so sometimes people think that philosophy just means coming up with a few ideas and throwing them around, and it's all just sort of loosey-goosey, and anything can mean anything, and anything goes in it, right? There's no right or wrong. I actually saw somebody put on Facebook, one of my artist friends, when I pointed out that he misattributed something to a philosopher. He's like, oh, you know, not only can we not know about these sort of things, it doesn't even matter getting right what they said. So if Augustine said this, and he says that he actually said something different. That doesn't matter, because it's all, you know, philosophy. So it's all whatever we make of it. Well, we're not going to do that, right? Now the other extreme, and we want to avoid extremes in this, the other extreme is to say, oh, it's this very abstract discipline and you're never going to be able to master it or get your head around it because it's only for the, you know, the super elite intellectuals. And Aristotle didn't think that. Plato didn't think that. If you read them, you see, you know, Socrates went around, he didn't just talk with, you know, the people that he thought were smart enough to talk with. He talked with everybody. And he sort of tested out, you know, can this person measure up to some of these ideas? Sometimes people think that the philosophy is just irrelevant or, you know, beyond them. And I tend to think that it's a lot of our modern philosophers who put that in their head. It's unfortunate. It's just a sort of fact of the profession. But the good news is Aristotle is not beyond any of you. He hasn't been beyond any students for about 2,300 years. And he's going to continue not being beyond other students for millennia, so long as, you know, society doesn't collapse or anything like that. So, in reality, philosophy is one of the oldest academic disciplines. And why has it stayed around so long? Well, because it actually is relevant. It actually does have a lot to say. When it's done well, it can inform all the other disciplines that you might study. From artistic disciplines to social sciences to business, pick whatever you want. Philosophy has something to contribute to it. Again, when it's done well. There's a whole body of classical literature, and I had you read a little bit of that, in which it actually is done well. Now, you know, when you read Aristotle for the first time, you may say, oh boy, if this is done well, I don't think I want to read any more of this. And actually, that was my reaction when I first read Aristotle. I didn't like him as an undergraduate. I didn't start liking him until I was a grad student, started reading him, not in translation, but in Greek. So I can sympathize with that. But he is part of this body of classic literature. And again, it's sort of like Escoffier. Why do people keep coming back to this? It's not just because he has a sort of cachet, you know, a name value. Escoffier did, you know, these things that you're talking about. He transformed things. Even that isn't enough. I mean, we can just leave that behind after a while and say, well, you know, this is the new MO. It's not even really the MO now, is it? There's some changes that have come about that have modernized the modernizing. There's still some other things to this that makes it a classic. It's the same thing for Aristotle. It's the same thing for Plato. It's the same thing for any other great philosopher you're going to read. Now, it requires a lot of work. And we're not going to try to pretend like we're doing all of that work here today. This will require you doing some more thinking and working on your own. And actually, you could use a lot of culinary metaphors for this, I think. I often do when I tell non-culinary students about this. I say that this is stuff you have to sort of allow to marinate, or you have to ruminate upon it, or you have to allow it to be digested, and then, you know, become part of the fabric of your mind. And there's something true to that. Now, what is Aristotle doing? What is the philosopher going to contribute? Some of the typical things that you're going to see philosophers doing are looking at things systematically. And again, you know, parallels to some of the culinary greats are along those lines too. Escoffier looked at things systematically, didn't he? He couldn't have made the revolutionary changes that he did if he didn't look at things as a whole. If he only focused in on that one station, he'd have never gotten to any of the higher levels, let alone transforming the entire kitchen. Aristotle's doing something like that with ideas, and with practices, and with moral conceptions. What else do they do? Well, you'll see the Aristotle doing this. They take in everybody else's ideas, and then they sort of weigh them. They want to see what's good and what's bad in them. That makes it difficult to read Aristotle, because sometimes you can't tell when he's actually endorsing an idea himself, and when he's actually just throwing it out there and saying, well, some people say this. Sometimes he'll say, some people say this, and they're dead wrong. Then you know Aristotle's not endorsing it, right? And they'll say, some people are saying this, and there's something to what they're saying. It gets a little tougher then. Sometimes he just throws it out there. Some people say this. You don't know actually whether he's endorsing it or not until you read other parts of it. What else? Drawing connections between things. That's part of the active philosophy. Also making important distinctions. This is something that we really don't teach enough in our primary education, secondary education, and we don't teach it an awful lot thematically in college. Drawing good distinctions. Being able to say, well, you're right in this sense, but also wrong in this sense. Being able to draw the distinction between performing a function and performing a function well. Oftentimes we collapse things in together. And when we get into arguments with each other, if you actually pay close attention to what we're arguing about, quite often it turns out that we've made some assumptions that tied things together that actually should be distinguished from each other. So we want to be kind of careful with that, and Aristotle does that. There is one other thing, too, I want to say about this reading selection, a caution that I think I tried to pass on through Professor Shaka before, and that's you're reading stuff that was written in ancient Greek, and then it was translated by stuffy Oxford guys about a century ago. There are better translations, but they're not public domain, which is why you're reading what you've got. And bless you, the translations are not always consistent, and they don't always pick the best word to translate things. One of the examples of this is actually judgment, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Why there's a seeming hang-up about not having judgment in some things that seem to actually really require judgment. I know that you guys talked a little bit about that before. So I don't want to say that you can't depend on the translations at all, but anytime that you think that, well, Aristotle just has to be completely off base here, because this sounds completely stupid, it's probably not Aristotle's fault. It's probably the translator. So you want to be a bit careful with that sort of stuff. Best way of getting around that, unless you actually want to learn Greek, is to compare translations with each other. You know, look at a couple different ones.
Do you have one offhand that we should look for that'll be a little more accessible, you think?
No. The reason, and I should, but the reason I don't is because if I want to know what Aristotle is saying, I just go to the Greek. And so I should put the time into like thinking about that. I do know of one new one that just came out that I'm sure is really good because I actually know one of the translators. Because I got a little pamphlet in the mail for it the other day. They send these to professors. But that one's actually not out yet. It's just coming out, so we're being offered the chance to buy it for cheap as professors. It's by Susan Collins and then somebody else. Of the Nicomachean Ethics. But yeah, other great translations I'm not sure. But you know, if you compare translations with each other, well, oftentimes you can get a better sense of what's being said. So now what I want to do is I want to start with some of the questions that Professor Shaka compiled from your session last class, and I've got 6. So the first one is pretty broad. Why did we read this? Well, that's a good question to ask. I actually sometimes begin my other classes by asking my students that. And if you want a trivial answer, what would it be? Well, you had to. They told you to. Now, how satisfying is that as an answer? It might be satisfying for some.
Well, yeah, but then on the others, it could just piss you off.
True.
I mean, but at the same time, you know, like, if you have read any other philosophers, then you understand that in order to represent yourself better, or in a conversationalist, then you would have to read this.
Yeah. Now, of course, you're sort of looking ahead. If this is a book and you're asking about, well, how does it end? You've already read the ending,
Of course.
right? Other people might say, well, I don't know. I don't know why I have to read this, but you know, I do what they tell me to do because there's a sort of yes chef mentality, and there's a lot of things that make more sense afterwards. And you understand them, you know, the reasons for them later. It was like that in the Army too, when I was a soldier. We were told first do the thing, and then worry about why you're supposed to do the thing, right? After you've done it, then you can.
Yours is not the reason why.
Well, that would be saying that you never get to answer, right? And that's not the case. Why isn't it satisfying just to be told, because I said so? You do want to know why, right? Well, Aristotle talks about that. He says in the Metaphysics, another one of his books, all human beings desire to know. This is a basic drive. Some of you actually put curiosity as something a chef should have, right? But it's not just a chefly quality, it's something that is part of what makes us human beings. Our curiosity goes way beyond all the other animals. The other animals that tend to be kind of curious, like monkeys and cats, things like that. Aristotle has something to say about this desire and how it plays itself out. He also, this is what leads us to purposive behavior. Notice we're already asking about why. What is the point of doing this? What is the goal? What is the end? What are we going to attain by this? We're already doing what Aristotle is talking about in asking why we ought to read Aristotle. So we're kind of presupposing the beginning of the inquiry right there. What are the implications for our lives, and how do we apply this in 2012? Those are two different questions that I sort of lumped in together. And notice they are two very different questions. One is asking about how to apply this in a context. The other one's asking about something very specific. You know, how do we apply this in 2012? One thing I'd like to say at the start is Aristotle is always going to say you should apply these things in context. That if what he's saying is any good, it ought to be able to be applied in context. If it wasn't, then, you know, sort of like Escoffier would be willing to say, if this is no longer helping you, get rid of it. It's not a museum piece. Aristotle would say that about his own Nicomachean Ethics. If you can't find a way to apply it in the present, then it no longer has any purpose, right? Now notice, though, there's a sort of assumption here, though, and I'd like you to think about this. Why assume that matters are so radically different in 2012 than they were in 1748 or in, you know, 4th century Greece? What has changed? I mean, there's a lot that has changed, right? Communication.
Technology.
Technology. The technology is really one of the big ones.
People.
Social order.
So the social order has changed. Now the question could be asked of, have people fundamentally changed?
Not fundamentally, no.
Yeah. And that's what Aristotle's talking about. That's why we still read it, because you're right, if it was just a matter of technology, then why would we, you know, that's sort of like talking about elevator operators. You know, do we want a book for how to be a good elevator operator? Do we have any elevator operators? They used to. We don't need them anymore because we have new technology. But there's parts of Aristotle's ethics that you may find not quite so useful, because some of it is dependent on social system. But the parts that have to do with human nature haven't really fundamentally changed. And they're probably not going to in our lifetime or any conceivable lifetime. Here's another good question. Why is this so complicated? Nietzsche wasn't even this complicated. Well, Nietzsche is actually that complicated to begin with. If you read through his stuff, I know because I used to crack my head on him. Heidegger, who was a major philosopher in the last century, said, because Nietzsche had read a lot of Aristotle, he said, if you want to understand Nietzsche, you need to study Aristotle for 10 years, and then go to Nietzsche, and then study Nietzsche for 10 years. Now, that's not a very satisfying answer, though, either. The better answer is, why is it so complicated? Well, because reality is complicated. And human beings are the most complicated parts of reality. You know, you might think about technology, like, you know, an iPhone. Think about all the chips and circuits and all that in there. This is not more complicated than you are. It's not more complicated than even your brain is. But it's not even as complicated as the rest of your body. And this is about the best we could do, you know, at this point with super complicated things. I mean, we have bigger computers, but, you know, it's the same general idea. in order to understand human nature, you have to be willing to put in a good amount of work. Just as if you want to understand all the different possible varieties of sauces, you'd actually have to do an awful lot of cooking, wouldn't you? If you want to understand the chemical processes going on, you actually have to study something about chemistry. So Aristotle is not needlessly complicated, but he is complicated. Here's another interesting one. Where does the argument fail? Now, here's something I'd ask in return. Are you sure there's just one argument here? That's something to think about. But let's assume that there is just one argument here. What I would like to say is, before you can ask about whether somebody's position is right or wrong, you have to fully understand their position. You have to really try to wrap your head around it, and then you can go on to criticize it. I know that quite often our pedagogy is we want to make everybody critical thinkers all the time, and I actually teach critical thinking, so I'm for critical thinking. But like Heidegger said, criticism presupposes understanding. So what we're going to do here today mostly is just trying to understand Aristotle, not really worrying about how can we find the holes in his position or things like that. Although I will point out some places where I think that he's made some mistakes. Another thing that came up, how do we make sense of Aristotle's distinction between making and doing, or acting, or poesis, or praxis for culinarians, not just in general, but for you guys. And we're going to get to this in the fourth part, so I'm going to actually put that off. And then another one that came up, why does Aristotle dissociate judgment from technique? Or judgment from practical wisdom, or judgment from art? Doesn't that seem kind of counterintuitive? That one's an easy one to get out of the way. That has to do with how we're translating judgment. There's a couple different Greek words that we would translate as judgment. And what he's talking about there is the Greek word for it is gnome, which has to do with sort of a capacity to figure things out in situations where discretion is called for. And you see him talking about that at the very end of it. That's not to say that judgment in the broader sense isn't involved in skill or arts or practical reason. That would be a different thing. That would be critique, the word that we actually get critic from, the broader sense of it. So there I have to apologize for the way the texts themselves fall out. So let's actually take a pause. Do you guys have any questions at this point before we start delving in? Anybody want to abandon ship before we actually go under the waters? No? Okay, well then let's go on and look at this notion of purposive activity. And so the very first sentence right there, I want to actually look at this kind of carefully. We're not going to do this with every single sentence because, that would take a semester. We don't have that. We have one night. But the words here are important. And I actually do want to point towards sort of the broader senses that the Greek terms have. So every art, by art you can also translate that as craft or discipline, productive discipline. The Greek word is techne, the word that we get technology from. Right? Techne was this wide thing that covered everything from saddle making to cooking to medicine in a certain respect. Sometimes it would get mixed up with another term, episteme, which means knowledge or discipline. Aristotle sometimes goes back and forth a bit with those. For instance, is strategy an art, or is it, as we would say, a science? Aristotle would say it's more of an art, actually. Or horse breaking. He brings it up as an example of an art, not one that we're very familiar with. Every inquiry. Greek word there is methodos, the word we get method from. That means some sort of structured inquiry. Everything that we want to know about. So, how are you doing is not actually an inquiry at that point. But going around and trying to find out how somebody is progressing with their illness or not progressing with their responding to medication, that would be an inquiry. If the IRS audits you, they're carrying out an inquiry, right? When you are tested on things, somebody is inquiring into the knowledge that you're supposed to have, the skills that you're supposed to have. So every inquiry, every action, that's a very broad term too. The term that he's using there is actually praxis. And I want to point out here that Aristotle uses praxis in both a narrow sense and also a broad sense. So some of the things that we talk about in this as production or as making would fall under that broad sense of praxis, but not under the narrow sense. And we'll get to that in a moment. So the things that you do in the classroom, the culinary classrooms, or the baking and pastry classrooms, those are action. You are producing something. Are any of you athletes? Student athletes? What you're doing out in the field is well, any of you play any sort of sports or games. That's action too. Getting yourself here is action. Putting yourself to bed, that's action. Everything, action encompasses just about everything. Even choosing to think about something is in a certain way a kind of action. Sitting down to read, that's an action. Every pursuit. Now, the word that he's using there, that's probably not the best translation. There's a lot of places later on where he talks about choice, virtue involving choice. The Greek word there is proeresis. Proeresis literally means to prefer one thing to another, to make a decision. This is better than that. To make a commitment that goes beyond just the moment and involves formation of your character, forming who you are. So this ties in very closely with these statements of belief that you get in the work. Who is it that you actually are? That, for Aristotle, is in large part a product of these choices, and it's what's being translated here as pursuit. So when you see this term pursuit, think something more broad than that. Think about how you form yourself. Think about how you chose to be on the path that you're on. It's a pursuit in that sense. Now he says all of these aim at some good. And he'll use a lot of other terms along the line. He'll talk about purpose. Another term you're going to see quite often coming up, and we're not quite used to thinking of this as end. Usually it only comes up for us when we say that's a means to an end. But what is an end? It's what you want to achieve. It's your purpose. It's your reason. Yeah, sometimes, use the word product. Sometimes the purpose for something is actually a product. Sure. As a matter of fact, a lot of times it is. What's the product of, say, medicine?
Healing.
Healing, or health. Yeah, I mean, health in the broad sense of like bringing everything back to where it ought to be. When you're actually sick, that means providing some healing. It can be very specific. The nurse who stitches you up because you, I don't know, fell off a ladder, cracked your head open, and now you actually have a hole that they have to stitch up. There's a purpose to that. She's producing something, namely your head being closed and no longer bleeding everywhere. And then maybe they give you some painkillers. And what's the purpose of that? So you're not hurting. So you can actually do things. So everything that we do is for some reason, he says. It aims at some good. Now, notice he also does talk about what you brought up. A certain difference is found among ends. Some are activities, he says. Some things we do for their own sake. Others are products apart from the activities that produce them. He says, when there are ends apart from the actions, it's the nature of the products to be better than the activities. Now think about that for a minute. Why do you want a doctor? Do you like going to the doctor just to hang out at the doctor's office? Some people might. We could talk about their purposes. Who likes to go to the doctor's office just to go to the doctor's office? People who want what? Attention. Yeah, I mean, if you want help, you actually have some legitimate reason for being there, right? People who want attention. Hypochondriacs are quite often people who want attention from other people. There's a purpose there. If they could get that attention in some other way, they wouldn't go to the doctor's office. They figured that's the best thing for them to do. When we go to the doctor's office, I mean, you might like talking with your doctor, you might like doing a chat, but if your doctor came in and just sat around and BS'd with you for a while and then said, it's been nice talking with you, I'll see you later, would you like that? Would that work for you? Well, let's think about restaurants. You go into a restaurant, the same sort of thing happens. The server comes over and says, yeah, we have all these great specials. This is a great place to work. I love it here. And then they walk off, and you're like, what were you supposed to do? You're supposed to, first,
Greet.
what's that?
What the servers do, greet, take an order.
Yeah, take the drink order first, right? Or at least, bring out some water or something. Maybe some menus, And then after a while, they should bring some food. And if they're not doing that, they're not serving a purpose. And the reason why we want that interaction with the server is to get the thing that we want. We value that more highly. That's what he's saying there in saying that it's the nature of their products to be better than the activities. Now, he also points out there's a lot of different activities that we're involved in, and they can be arranged in certain hierarchical ways. So that one thing leads to another thing, leads to another thing, leads to another thing. And you can ask this about just about anything you want to. Why are you here in this classroom, for example? I ask my students this all the time. Sometimes they have answers, sometimes they don't. You know why? Because oftentimes they haven't thought about it. They're just sort of following a routine. Why are you guys here? Some of you, are hungry and could have been at dinner or taking a nap. Why this? Yeah.
Stepping stone to get my AOS, which is the first step in my DPS career, and then hopefully I'm going to teach travel.
Yeah, and notice there's like a whole chain of different purposes. I want this for this, and I want this for this. Oftentimes we don't lay these things out. And one of the things that Aristotle calls our attention to is if we allow these things just to be sort of dictated to us, we're not going to be as well off as if we think about them. If we think about why we're doing the things that we do. And there's a lot of decisions that we make, or sort of let other people make for us, fail to make, because we don't look at what the purposes are. And sometimes the purposes could be a bit misleading. We may think that we're doing one sort of thing, and it turns out that really we ought to be doing another sort of thing. We'll look at some examples of that in a few minutes. Now let's think of some actual examples, though. Think about something that's an intimate part of your life here, brigade de cuisine, right? What is the whole purpose of that? What's the whole point of that?
It's to, one is the idea of the brigade is to not, overwork a station, and then overwork as in you're making things twice. Whereas, when you came up with the brigade system, it was, you go from station to station, and it'd be like separated, throughout this huge area, so you can find all of these things, and you say, like you have your expediter or whatever, and he's firing off tickets, and he's looking at his guy to the right, he's looking at his guy to the left, rather than like they have however system they had.
Yeah.
Versus now we have printers, and it's like, you go to the micros machine, you hear that rattle, you never want to hear it again in your life. But you have this expediter, and he's either on one side of the line or on the other. And basically what it comes down to is he's like, okay, eggs fire this, and entrees fire this, and fish guy do whatever you're gonna do. And then the whole idea of that was in order for one thing to line in the other, it was productivity, and you're saving, buku dollars at the same time.
So efficiency.
Efficiency.
Yeah, well, that's a very nice summary right there. Now notice there's a bunch of different purposes built into this. Is it adaptable to everything? Where did Escoffier first start doing this? Did you start doing it at home? You don't need it at home. What kind of restaurants? Yeah, large ones. Anyone knows the specifics?
Ritz.
Yeah, and that's a hotel, right? So a certain kind of clientele, a certain kind of environment brought about this reorganization, structure. And notice, it's what we call a teleological structure, which is what Aristotle's talking about here. You have Who's at the top? I'm not going to draw out the whole thing, but
Exactly, yeah.
and it's kind of interesting. I mean, chef means person in charge, right? It comes from French. Chef means chief. Then what do you have?
Secondary, super.
I'm not even gonna bother trying to fill all this stuff in. You can go down the entire line of things, and you have different specializations, right? Different arts, different skills. Does everybody know all the skills available?
Certainly.
Yeah, it's pretty rare that you actually have one person who can do everything in any given field. Yeah, that's where we get to something interesting. Now, if you're one of the specialists here, you're working with that sort of thing all the time, aren't you? Do you think the executive chef has the same level of skill as he could, or she could? There's no way. There's only 24 hours in a day. You actually have to sleep some of them. And you have to do other things. You can't do cuisine constantly. Even the sous chef can't follow every single thing that's going on. They should have a lot of the skills, and they should have them in general, but they may not have them honed to the same abilities as somebody who's actually doing something constantly day in, day out. But what Aristotle's talking about, which is really interesting, he uses examples like horsemanship and rhetoric and political science and all that sort of stuff. You could think of it in terms of the brigade de cuisine. Does the executive chef have to have some other skills? What Aristotle would call architectonic skills, meaning the skills that sort of guide everything else that people don't have to have at this level. What do they need?
Managerial skills. He has to be able to, from, if he has an owner, if he has somebody he has to report to, then he has to be the middle guy in between his suit and then obviously for middle managers. Versus, the middle managers is like the triangle or whatever of, and then versus the upside down triangle.
Yeah.
Where it's, exactly.
Yeah, now you notice, these are legitimate skills down here, but none of them are going to suffice for doing what needs to be done up here. Aristotle, points out that these skills can be arranged in a kind of hierarchy. I think the brigade de cuisine illustrates this very well. So when you guys wrote your pieces on, what did you call them? This We Believe?
It was, yeah.
And you were listing the qualities that a great chef, you didn't always say executive chef, most of you didn't actually say that, but I'm assuming that's what you meant. Some of those were managerial skills that you talked about. The ability to determine what to do, not just in one context, but with people. How to actually manage the skills of others. These skills feed into these. The purposes of these feed in ultimately to the purpose of the executive chef. What is the purpose of one of the stations? Just pick any one.
Fish station.
Okay, fish. What's the point of the fish station?
To produce the seafood protein for an entree.
There you go. And it's as simple as that. And to do it well, right? Not just to throw them on the plate.
Well, yeah.
Now we're done.
You're salmon.
And that includes a lot of things too nowadays. It's not just making something that's tasty with seafood. It's particularly important that it also be healthy, and not just in the sense of not super rich or something like that, but it's not poisoning you, right? That's one of the hazards of it. What is the point of that? Well, that feeds into other things, which feed into other things, and ultimately it gets up to the point of it gets up to the purpose of the executive chef. The purpose of the executive chef is to attend to the entire restaurant. What is the purpose of a restaurant? Just to exist for its own sake?
Hospitality.
Create profit by serving.
Okay, now notice, we have a bunch of different purposes sort of being laid out here. Profitability, serve the customer, there was one other one.
Art.
What's that?
Art.
There's another big one too. Maybe not in every restaurant.
No, some.
Sizzler probably not.
Ibui, though, is their, I guess, the pinnacle example we talked about gastronomy.
Yeah.
Or it shut down because it was so focused on art.
Well, yeah, and you have to be able to balance these different purposes against each other. You can't do that without actually thinking about what am I trying to accomplish here? What are my purposes? And Aristotle is sort of gearing us towards being able to think about all these frameworks in which we place things. And any framework that you can put something, you can probably find another bigger framework in which to put it. So this classroom, you know, what's going on here fits into the scope of your class, and your class fits into the scope of what? Culinary education, and that fits into the scope of what? Preparing culinarians to go out into the workforce. You notice that we have these wider and wider sets of purposes. I want to move ahead now. Well, actually, before we do that, let me mention one other thing, because this will lead into the next thing. This poll that you sent me the data for, I don't remember when that was done.
It was 2007.
Okay, so there was this poll, and you may have, did you tell them about this? There's a poll of culinary students. Why are you in this at all? What's the purpose? And the results were pretty interesting. Professor Shaka has used this at a number of different conferences to tell people about what's going on here at the culinary. 1 out of 10 students said they wanted to be famous. Now, that's understandable, right? We have this phenomenon of the super chef, the celebrity chef. 1 out of 10 said they wanted to take care of their family, so very clear economic motives. 2 out of 10 said they wanted to have their own place one day. And that can be understood in terms of economic motives, I think, but also probably in terms of independence, perhaps something similar to being famous. Maybe those coincide to some degree. And then 6 out of 10 said to do what I love. So that's what the cohorts before you have been saying about what they're doing here, that they want to do what they love. Now that could mean a lot of different things, couldn't it? How many of you are here primarily to do what you love, you say? Now what does that actually mean?
To me, I mean, I've done front of house work, I've done office work, I've done game testing, I've done IT stuff. And nothing was quite as satisfying as standing on a line,
Okay.
being yelled at.
Nothing was as satisfying. That's not just being yelled at, because you could go get that somewhere else.
Yeah,
right?
just being on the line itself.
Yeah. It's a certain part of the activity, right?
How many people said?
Almost everybody.
Yeah.
What else? What does it mean to other people there?
Create something with their hands.
Okay.
That is
That's what you
obviously
love.
later to be destroyed, but it's the idea of, I mean, it's you know, it's the ability to create something with your hands, obviously, and, you know, physically see pleasure through somebody else, you know, like, wow, this is cool. And then
To generate pleasure for somebody else. Yeah, there's really something to that. Yeah.
Daniel?
Doing what I love is using my stronger personality traits, I guess.
Okay.
So this career kind of takes my main personality traits and
Find something to do with them that
uses all
allows them to flourish, allows them to unfold. Yeah.
So
That's
creativity and then like fulfilling other people's needs. So it goes along.
That's understandable. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, I think one of the big reasons for me is a necessity, in the sense that people always need food. Whereas I could go be an accountant, train money for someone, or invent technology like the iPhone.
Yeah.
It's not something people are gonna need, but as a society, we're always gonna need food.
Well, I mean, in our lifetime, they're probably always going to need accountants. but-
Yeah.
You mean the broader?
I mean, it's a basic human need.
Yeah.
That is something I think that's becoming rarer and rarer.
Yeah, and not just to eat, but to actually have things that taste good. Again, we come back to the issue of pleasure, providing other people with pleasure. Yeah.
The thing I love about it is you create something and which you actually got to think deeply about it if you're creating a dish. And when you serve it, people people taste it and they either like it or don't. And it's just so simple for them. And that gives me the luxury to have my own work because they don't get it. They just simply decide whether they like it or not.
Okay. So you can see there's a lot of range in doing what I love, right? It can mean a lot of different things. Again, we have to come back to thinking about what is it that you're actually after. It's very easy to say things like, I'm going to do what I love. It's another to actually spell that out for yourself and to figure out what it is that you're actually driving for. And this is a good segue into Aristotle's discussion of happiness, which I'm going to go through pretty quick because I actually consumed far too much time with the first part. So maybe we'll do Q&A right after that. Aristotle talks about happiness, and by happiness, he doesn't mean just sort of a temporary being in a good mood or feeling pleasure necessarily momentarily or feeling even joy. He means something a bit more lasting. The Greek word is eudaimonia, which literally means having a good sort of spirit pervading your being. And it's often been translated as flourishing. So when you flourish, I think all of you have seen things like this. When somebody flourishes, those parts of themselves that otherwise might sort of lay stagnant, they get to unfold. They get to experience what makes them actually feel fulfilled. So that's what he's talking about with happiness. And he considers a lot of different candidates for happiness. One of the handouts that I have for you, in the second part, he considers a couple different candidates for this. And you do see people in Aristotle's time, just as in our time. Again, this is one of those constants of human nature. This is on that second page of the first handout. There's certain things they gravitate towards. Wealth is one of them. A lot of people think that making a ton of money or having a lot of possessions is going to make them happy. Aristotle thinks that's misguided. It's not that, having money is bad or pursuing money is bad, but why do we want money? I mean, I've got, I don't have much right now. I just have a $1 in my wallet, but that doesn't make me particularly happy in and of itself. I mean, our money, it's kind of drab looking. Other people's banknotes are kind of colorful. There's this kind of aesthetic appeal to them. But even with that, what is this good for?
$1 worth of
Pleasure.
Well, yeah, which is not an awful lot, is it? I mean, when I was a kid, this would buy you like 4 packs of gum or 4 candy bars. Now, maybe 1. Maybe not even that, depending on where you are.
Can of soda.
Can of soda, yeah. What's that?
Not even a
Snickers at $1.25.
Yeah. Money's only good if you can exchange it for things. Even possessions, they're only good so far as you can use them. I mean, you can have 20 cars in your driveway. Well, you probably would have to have a parking lot rather than a driveway, but you get the idea. You can only drive 1 car at a time. I mean, you could say, well, I invite all my friends over, and then we all drive around together. But there you're involving more than you. And what is the purpose there? It's something bigger than just having lots of cars. It's friendship. We're doing activities together. It's not having the cars that's really going to fulfill you. It's what you can do with them. What about pleasure? Just pleasure by itself. This is an interesting one to think about for culinarians because part of your job is to give other people pleasure, right? You're not successful if people come into your restaurant and they say, I had an unpleasant experience. You feel pleasure in seeing other people's pleasure, right? So maybe pleasure could be the whole goal. Maybe just, satisfying all of our desires, for food, for drink, sleep, sex, all of our physical desires would be enough. Aristotle thinks there's something lacking to that. And I think you guys probably do too. Otherwise you would just be pursuing pleasure. You wouldn't be here in a classroom. Yeah?
Well, I remember one part where he said for pleasure is a state of soul.
Well, Aristotle thinks that we're not just our bodies.
Right.
The soul is what makes our body alive. It's what makes our bodies sentient. So when we feel pleasure, we often think of it as I'm feeling pleasure, drinking coffee, for example.
That's a physical.
We think about it as I'm feeling pleasure, like, on my tongue. You guys do a lot of analyses of this, where
Right.
exactly is the pleasure taking place. But it's really in my person, who I am.
Right. I gathered that he was trying to say that happiness can only come within you, not just your outside state.
Well, he thinks that in large part it has to do with your personality, with who you are and how you live. I mean, he does think you have to have some wealth. If you're totally poor, if you're living on the street, you're probably not going to be that happy, for Aristotle. He would look at some other people's conceptions of happiness. For instance, think about religious orders. People become monks or nuns and they take these vows of poverty. Aristotle would look at that and say, nah, they're not going to be happy. And maybe he's wrong about that, because some of them report being quite happy. He also thinks that you need to have friends and hopefully family. You can't, when he's talking about self-sufficiency, he doesn't mean you go off and you live by yourself like a miser, or somebody, with a compound and
Just
barbed
that you're
wire.
independent.
Yeah, enough that you can provide for yourself, you can have connections with other people. Think about what it takes just to enjoy yourself with other people in terms of eating and drinking.
Sure.
Right, you guys do this all the time, right? You cook for each other? What would it be like if somebody said, no, I'm not going to put anything into the kitty. I'm not going to bring anything to the potluck. I'm just going to do everything on my own. Could they participate in these sort of things?
Up to a point.
Yeah, they could eat a bit and then get kicked out.
Right. Well, I mean, no, I'm saying, there would be a couple of times when they were participating or they weren't.
Yeah.
And then, they wouldn't bring anything and they wouldn't be invited or whatever.
Yeah, there has to be enough. So this goes to this question of whether it's totally within ourselves. There has to be enough to allow us to actually interact with other people. Because for Aristotle, other people are part of our
So it's just
happiness.
balance.
Say again?
Balance.
Yeah, there has to be a balance between it. You couldn't just derive happiness for him from other people. So Aristotle wouldn't see a life, again, maybe he's missing out on something. He wouldn't see a life that's just totally of service to other people as a happy life. Mother Teresa seems to have, been pretty happy with hers, but Aristotle didn't know hers. So. He is somewhat restricted by his time and culture. Let's move on to another candidate. If it's not just physical pleasure, maybe it's something like honor or prestige. People do desire this, don't they? I mean, why open your own restaurant? It could be just to make a lot of money, but there's plenty of other ways to make a lot more money that are a lot more reliable than opening a restaurant, aren't there? Yeah.
Could you elaborate on the part where he said, when you were speaking about honor,
Yeah.
he says, honor, pleasure, reason, and every virtue, for if nothing resulted from them, we should still choose each of them.
Oh, there he's actually talking about what we choose for their own sakes. So let me erase this. It's not completely erasing.
Because when he speaks about that sort of thing,
Yeah.
I get from it that you're not happy because you're doing the right thing, but you're doing the right thing to become happy.
Not exactly. Happiness in the broadest sense. So, being fulfilled.
The happiness comes after is what I meant by that.
It comes with it, actually.
Okay.
He's not talking about a temporal succession, where, this happens and then this happens after it. He's talking about sort of a logical connection between these, why we choose this or why we choose that. So happiness or fulfillment or flourishing. This we choose for its own sake. It would be crazy to say, I'm going to choose to be happy so I can make a ton of money. That would be like totally backwards priorities, right? There are a lot of other things that we do choose for their own sake. People They choose a lot of pleasures, and if you ask them, why are you engaging in that pleasure? Because it's pleasant. So that's for its own sake, you know. You're watching TV, which I think probably all of us find pleasant, at least some shows. Why are you watching the show? I mean, you may have some, you know, thing like, I'm going to do a book report on this later on, or, you know. But usually, why are we watching it? Well, because we enjoy it. We're deriving entertainment from it. If you're doing that, and that's going to, you think, make you happy, then you're actually pursuing pleasure for the sake of happiness, but you also want the pleasure too. It's not like you only want the pleasure for the sake of happiness. You want the pleasure because you think that's what happiness is. Same thing with honor. People can defer an awful lot of pleasure so that they can attain a sort of status or prestige. And why do they do that? Well, because they think that that honor, or you know, whatever else you want to call it, is going to make them happy, whether they're right or wrong. I mean, a lot of this you can look at experientially. Look at other people's lives and see whether pursuing this kind of life actually does make them happy or not. And then he talks about wisdom or knowledge. Even this. Why do people, say, become college professors? It doesn't pay an awful lot compared to other things you could do with an advanced degree. Why not just get an MBA instead? Make a ton of money then. Well, because, you know, I like reading books and talking about this kind of stuff and thinking about it. But why? Well, because we think that's going to make us happy. And, you know, and if it doesn't make you happy, then people will stop pursuing this sort of thing. And finally, he talks about virtue, or moral excellence. And virtue, you could also think of, in broader terms, as also what he calls the intellectual virtues, these crafts, you know, your skill in what you do. I think that a lot of you are studying these things not just as means for an end, but if you're doing what you love, you actually think it's going to make you happy. You're pursuing it for the sake of happiness, but you're also pursuing it because you think it's valuable in itself. Something that doesn't fit that would be like wealth. I mean, if you think that wealth by itself is going to make you happy, you're going to have a rough time ahead, right? Because it's not going to. But if you trade wealth for pleasure, a lot of people want to be wealthy so they can buy stuff that gives them pleasure, or that affords them the time to pursue wisdom, or that allows them to exercise virtue, develop the virtue, or, you know, to be a big shot, to be, you know, honor, right? These are done for the sake of themselves, but also for the sake of happiness. This is really only for the sake of something else. And really anything that you're making a sacrifice, you're putting up with something to get something else, it would be over on this side too. So all the things you don't like about your culinary education, that's over here, right? You're not enjoying it, but you realize that it's good for you, right? And it'll give you wisdom or, you know, virtue or something like that. So you do it. That's a good question. He also does talk about health at other points, and I guess health would be probably something over here too. Health is really a means to an end. It's not the best thing in and of itself. People that only are concerned with health, there's something kind of missing from their lives. You know. Let's now talk about virtue itself. Or actually, before we do that, any other questions before we jump into virtue? Yeah.
Characteristics that are looked at as happiness, do you think that Aristotle sees them as like they're influenced because of society, or do you think Aristotle thinks that our view of happiness depends on like your personal?
That's a good question. I would actually say both. We get our conception of happiness. We get messages about what we ought to take as our conception of happiness constantly thrown at us in our society because we're media saturated.
Because like society kind of influences you to think that if you have a lot of money, you'll be happy.
Yeah.
But a lot of people who have money actually aren't happy. So
Yeah, or think about commercials. If you just have this product, you're going to
Yeah.
be happy. You know, 30-minute sequence on, they work basically two ways. Either you get this and then it's a party all the time, or your life is fulfilled, or you buy this car and it's smooth driving and maybe you'll run into a wolf, you know, that'll be kind of cool. Or they try to scare you, right? And they say if you don't buy this deodorant, people aren't going to like you, and you're going to have an awful life, you know. Or if you don't buy this detergent, your clothes are going to be dirty and people won't like you. And yeah, you're constantly getting bombarded with messages about what happiness consists in. So you have your own conceptions of happiness that you have to work out, and you're not doing it in a vacuum, and you're not, you know, completely unique. This, as they often say, snowflake that is totally different than every other snowflake in the world. I mean, we have certain basic drives in common. There are certain aspects to our personality that will map onto each other fairly well. So that's why we can talk about these things in the first place. But experientially, we actually do have to kind of weigh these things against each other. And you notice, you never actually like pursue pleasure per se. You always pursue this kind of pleasure, that kind of pleasure. You know, if I have a weakness for coffee, that's a weakness for a particular kind of pleasure. That's not the same thing as having a weakness for absinthe, you know, which I never had. I don't know if I'd have a weakness for absinthe or not. No? Well, it's supposed to be very bitter, right?
If you like anise,
Yeah.
it's like licorice or ninja.
Oh, yeah.
You like ritual liquor.
Wouldn't be for me. And it's the same thing when we pursue honor. We're not pursuing honor per se. We pursue, well, I want this position, or I want this prize. And even, you know, the kinds of wisdom that we develop, or the kinds of knowledge that we develop, it's determinate. And the virtues, they can be identified. I mean, if you are courageous and I'm courageous, we have something in common. But your courage is exercised in different circumstances than mine is, and in different ways. So, yeah, to answer your question, there's the part you're getting from everybody else, and then there's the part that you're getting from yourself. You may have certain capacities too. Aristotle talks close to the end of what we were looking at about certain natural virtues. Some of us, again, use courage. Some of us are more naturally given to, say, doing things like public speaking. Some people are just terrified of it. And with habituation, the person who's terrified can actually overcome that fear and become courageous. But the other person has a leg up on them, don't they? It's easier for them to develop that. Some of these may be, some of these answers may be harder to resist for certain people. So that plays into it as well. This is a good stepping point for moral virtue as well, talking about virtue. And I'm going to go through this very quickly. Aristotle thinks that there are certain qualities of character that we need in order to function well as human beings. And he says the virtue of a thing makes that thing be in good condition, and it also makes that thing good for other things. So if this is in terms of, well, let's think about a book. You know, what is it for a book to be in good condition? This book is actually starting to get out of good condition, right? The spine's starting to break. But, you know, like I always point out, the words are still in there. I can still read it and I can get what I want out of it. That works for this. It's good in its nature. It's also good in the use that I can make of it. It's good for something. What about you? Well, let's look at some of the qualities that you guys actually brought up in terms of moral virtues. One of you, I don't remember who, said a good chef should not be a glutton. You should eat to live, not live to eat. If you're a glutton and you're a chef, you're probably going to be hard to work with, aren't you? And this is not the field in which, you know, you want to have sort of a disordered appetite towards food or drink, especially drink. You know, if you're drunk all the time, can you be a good chef? What's that?
You can't be a good anything.
Good drunk.
Yeah.
Good at drinking games, perhaps. For a while, then, you know, after a while, the brain burns out. Yeah, that's a quality that's needed. Now, if you actually have weaknesses towards food or drink or something like that, can you just snap your fingers and, I'm not going to do that anymore? Can you just have an intention? Is that going to carry you through? Or people talk about having a passion or making a decision. No, it has to become something habitual. It requires some discipline. You actually have to like stand up against temptation and say, I really want to do this, but I'm not going to do it. And then the next time it gets a little bit easier, right? And the next time, and eventually you actually want to be that way. That's what it is to acquire a virtue. Another good example, patience for oneself. You guys talked about patience quite a bit. Patience for oneself, not getting down on oneself for not getting something immediately. Patience not just for oneself, but for everyone around you, and also the patience to teach those willing to learn. You identified that as what a great chef or a great culinarian wants to have. Some of us are naturally more patient than others. Can you develop patience if you don't have it? That would be a virtue then. That would be something that would actually make you be able to do what it is that you do well. And if you're doing what you do well, you will be happy. That's why Aristotle constantly stresses virtue. You'll also have pleasure, but you'll have pleasure as sort of a byproduct of doing what it is that actually fulfills you. How did you put it before? That allows your sort of innate qualities to be developed or express themselves. That would be.
You mean characteristics of
Yeah.
happiness? Is that what
The
you-
characteristics, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Characteristics of a person. What the virtues would do, it would be provided they're good characteristics, allow those characteristics to actually be fully developed. And that will make you, so that's a very thumbnail sketch of virtue. Let's, because we don't have a lot of time, let's move on to talk about this praxis and poesis thing. So that's moral virtue. Moral virtue is always some sort of mean, it involves a habit, requires a lot of modeling after people. What about other things like your craft? Aristotle talks about the crafts or the skills or the arts, the techni, as being a kind of virtue, an intellectual virtue. That means that it's something that you develop through doing. It's a little bit different than moral virtue in that it could be used for good or it could be used for bad. Moral virtues, by definition, they're being used for good. Otherwise, they're not moral virtues, right? Could you use your culinary skills for evil?
Sure.
Yeah, be Hitler's cook, right?
Poison.
Yeah, you could poison somebody. There was actually an interesting guy back in it was 19th century France, and his name was Gruyère, and he killed people by feasting them to death. So this wouldn't be cooking; he'd be employing other people's culinary skills. He was a great gourmand, and he would order up these incredibly rich, dishes night after night after night, like course after course after course. I guess he had a lot of money, and he would invite people out for that, and he'd form friendships with other sort of epicures, and then he would try to get them to eat as much rich food as possible so that they would die. That's what got this guy going.
That's so weird.
He got done in by a French cavalryman whose reputation was, of course this isn't physically possible, but that he had hollow legs where he stuffed all the other food. Because this guy could just eat. And he actually killed Gruyère. He took on it as a challenge. So that would be a very evil thing to do, wouldn't it? You don't necessarily even have to poison them, just give them really fatty food.
Here's butter, eat.
Yeah. I remember Professor Shockey had me read Kitchen Confidential, and I was amazed at Bourdain's description of just how much butter is in good tasting food. That can't be good for you. And you could extend this to other things too. Can your craft be used for good things or bad things? Sure. Good example of somebody using culinary things for clearly, explicitly moral ends, Jamie Oliver. Going in and trying to get people to adapt healthier diets. bar is not set that high for school lunch programs to begin with, but you know, anything's an improvement. Now, your skills involve the same sort of issues about purposes. You can ask for your skills. What are the purposes you're trying to attain with them? What is the goal of it? And a lot of what you're doing as culinarians is learning how to connect up your actions, the sets of actions that you do, with the goals. So here we get to those sort of criteria that you're asking about. Can you ask whether something is being done well or being done poorly in a skill setting? That's part of what makes it a skill. Part of what else makes it a skill is that you can't have absolute certain criteria for it. That's what differentiates it from, say, a science. There's a kind of, here we come also to judgment. There's a need to cultivate a kind of capacity to judge that can't be, you know, turned into something just like a recipe. That can't be purely technologized. I can't remember who wrote this, but somebody talked about two kinds of professionalism. One being where it just becomes like sort of being a cog in the machine, right? That would not be the same thing as what Aristotle's talking about as skill. None of you want to fall into that too, right?
Right.
Yeah. You want to be able to exercise some creativity. You want to be able to take, you know, the ingredients before you, adapt them to each other, make them fit each other. That is what Aristotle's talking about as the intellectual virtue of poesis, of technique, of being able to produce things. To go to, you know, the question about breaking down a leg of lamb, or what is this, the side of lamb, or?
Leg of lamb.
Okay, a leg of lamb. That's a productive activity. You're not actually making something new. It's not like there's any more lamb left when you're done with it. There's actually a little less. But you're generating a new product. Just like when you're cooking and you're making a dish, you're taking ingredients and you're producing something. And you're producing more than one thing, too. And this is something worth keeping in mind as well. Again, it goes to the question of purposes. When you're producing as a cook, as a chef, as a baker, anything, what are you actually trying to produce?
Finished product.
Yeah,
Desirable product.
For pleasure.
these are all right. A finished product, something that you can say, well, look, that's actually cooked. You know? That's actually done. You know, sometimes I bake bread and it turns out to be, you know, still mushy in the middle. I'm not a great baker. I sort of eyeball it. What did you say?
A desirable product.
A desirable product. Okay. And why is it desirable? Because it produces pleasure. You're actually seeking the pleasure of another, not just your own pleasure. Very often you actually have to sacrifice your own pleasure for a while in the sort of things that you do, don't you? You have to put up with a lot of pain at times to produce great cuisine.
When you're talking about the exchange of, you know, pleasure for honor. Because you might, you know, you 20
Yes.
great steaks in a day, and you're not going to get to taste any of those steaks, but you're going to get the honor of knowing that 20 people had pleasure in eating your steak.
Well,
At the same time, it's wisdom though too. Because
that's a little bit beyond honor. That gets more in the territory of virtue. Like, what if none of those people knew who you were? Would you still actually feel good about it? Would that be part of happiness for you if nobody's actually coming up and saying, good job? Because sometimes you're going to be in situations where nobody actually rewards you for what you're doing. And some of you probably have been in situations like that.
So,
Then what carries you through is virtue.
so honor can't be from within.
Well, what Aristotle's calling honor is something that comes from outside. I mean, we can use terms in a lot of different ways. What he means by honor is other people honoring you.
I got you.
Yeah, and so your how to put it, your self-satisfaction in your craft would be what you're trading off against their pleasure, I suppose. You could even think of this, you know, when you're cooking and it's not in a restaurant, it's just for the people that you like. They may look at you and just say, oh, you're just a cook. Right? This is, you know, even though we have celebrity chefs, a lot of people would say something like that. But you could take pride in what it is that you're doing. Now, Aristotle distinguishes, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about, he distinguishes between production or poesis and action or doing or praxis. And in the selection that I gave you, it looks like the two of them are totally incompatible. Actually, let me read some of the passages that I think probably were hanging you up a little bit, where he says, making and acting being different, art must be a matter of making, not of acting. You know, so art, what it is that you do, has nothing to do with acting or praxis or doing in the large sense. It has nothing to do with practical wisdom. That may give you that impression. He says, he's using architecture. Since architecture is an art and is essentially a reasoned state of capacity to make, there is neither any art that is not such a state nor any state that is not an art. Art is identical with a state of capacity to make. All art is concerned with coming into being, with making something happen, something produced, with contriving and considering how something may come into being which is capable of being or not being, and whose origin is in the maker and not in the thing made. For art is concerned neither with things that are or come into being by necessity, nor those which do it by nature. These have it in themselves. This makes it all sound as if these are totally separate categories. A better way to think about it, because that's one of those passages of Aristotle where if you had other passages of Aristotle, it would make a bit more sense. Think of them as being sort of laid over each other. Breaking down a rack of land, or not a rack, a leg of land, for example. That is a making. You are producing something. Can you ask the question, why? Sure. And the answer to that might be, well, because we need a whole bunch of pieces that we can serve. That's clearly a matter of art. There are criteria for that. Did you do it in a sloppy way? Are they all jumbled up and they look completely different from each other because you didn't exercise technical expertise? Did you slice them beautifully in just the right way? There are criteria for that. Going beyond that, though, we have the realm of practical wisdom. Why did you make them that way? Let me give a really easy example. Think about the brigade de cuisine again. If you're at one of the lower levels, what is the purpose there for you? Is it just to be a cog in the machine? Or are you part of something larger?
Part of something larger, as well as being.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is.
What's your purpose there? It's develop skill.
Can you have different reasons for doing what it is that you're doing that would interfere with the well-functioning of the machine?
Your own reasons.
Yeah. Like what?
Money.
That might actually make you work better, right? They'll take away your paycheck if you're not going to do what they want.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
What might cause interference with the person next to you or the person who's taking the product that you're generating and then using that in their product?
Taking your product and having praise for it that you will never see.
If you were, for example, only to do well when somebody's constantly praising you because you desire it, well, not only would you not make it yourself, you would screw things up for everybody else with each other. And it would like send shockwaves up through the whole thing. This is one of the vulnerabilities of the brigade de cuisine. You need people who can actually work with each other. Well, is that just a matter of technical expertise? Is that a matter of craft for you, being able to work well with other people? Or is that a matter of practical wisdom? Even just cutting up a leg of lamb can be an occasion, or think about it as a locus for you to exercise practical wisdom. Practical wisdom is tied in with these virtues, these traits that you identified, like patience, or another example that you guys had was, I particularly liked, Being humble and not arrogant. Being honest and selfless, keeping your promises to yourself and the ones around you. If you're unreliable, you can't really be a good part of a brigade cuisine, can you? And of course they'll fire you because it's a quick turnover, but you also will interfere with the purposes of what's going on. A lot of what you guys identified as these ideals that you want to strive after can be thought of in terms of Aristotle's categories. So again, think of your technical expertise as being one thing, what you produce. And that's a good thing. He's not saying it's totally morally neutral or anything like that. It's a good thing to be good at cooking, to be good at butchery, to be good at identifying, what things are safe, what things aren't. Practical wisdom is something above that. Then we get into the distinctively moral domain. And that isn't just a matter of right and wrong. That's a matter of how well you steer yourself towards what's ultimately going to fulfill you. The last thing I want to end with is Aristotle says something that, and then we'll do some Q&A if you guys want to stick around, because I know I'm going a little bit over time. The last thing I want to focus on, he does lay out an ideal for it. He says, all the states we've considered converge to the same point. When we speak of judgment and understanding and practical wisdom, we credit the same people with possessing judgment and having reached years of reason with having practical wisdom and understanding. Because all of these things deal with the ultimates, which are what? The particulars. The particulars don't mean, abstract things out there. That means your life, your actual kitchen, your progression. It's one thing to have sort of abstract ideals. It's another to realize them in practice. And Aristotle is talking about tying all these things together in practical wisdom. What is going to steer you towards what's going to fulfill you, what's going to make you happy. So this puts it in kind of an interesting framework that you may not have thought about before. And this isn't sort of the end point. I only gave you we just really scratched the surface with Aristotle. But this gives you some things that may help you to think about as you work on your statements of belief, what we are. So let's do some Q&A. Or any other things that are bothering you about this? Or, yeah.
Well, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is forgive me if I was writing some notes while you said this, but why is this self-fulfillment and happiness important?
Oh, Aristotle thinks that that's sort of a question that doesn't have any answer, because even to pose it is to sort of ask about, like, why are we human beings? He thinks we just do, in fact, desire to be happy. We don't always have the best idea of what it means to be happy. And for some people, being happy means getting in conflict with other people and having something to complain about all the time. But that's sort of a diminished notion of happiness.
So we're approaching this as just taking it as a given.
Yeah, there are always something that you do have to take as a given, and that's one of them for Aristotle. That we do, in fact, desire to be happy. It's hard to. I've actually struggled with that, because as a philosopher, I didn't want to just take things as a given, and I tried to think my way around this. Well, can you find some example of somebody who really doesn't want to be happy? But usually, when you do that, it turns out, well, they've got this distorted conception of happiness that consists in, I think about somebody who likes people beating them, a masochist, right?
Right.
Why do they like that? Well, they get a charge out of it.
Right.
Which leads us again to they like being happy.
I guess my context of the question is, does it turn around that happiness is the best thing for us? It might be what we most want, but is it the best thing for us as individuals, or on the political sense?
Yeah, see, now that's, again, that's one of the strengths of Aristotle's view. If you have a distorted conception of happiness, like if you think it's just pleasure, you're not really going to be happy. So the question of whether, let's say you got happiness, but it wasn't a good thing for you, you couldn't have happiness in the full sense without it being a good thing for you, because you couldn't actually make it there without having developed your personality to be able to appreciate it. Again, with that issue of sort of unfolding these things that are within you. Which, you know, it could mean that we don't actually enjoy full happiness.
No, you can say the same thing about that you're not going to be happy unless you're a positive contributor to the politics.
You mean to one society, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Aristotle certainly thought we are social animals. We need to be in relationships with other people, you know, at the level of the family, and then at the larger level of our society, and also in terms of friendship. And if you don't have good relations with other people, in part because you're not a good person, you know, doing bad things, you're not going to really be happy. And again, you can think about this there's all these temptations in the kitchen, aren't there? To exploit people, and you guys talked about some of these in your statements about what the person ought not to do. Doesn't take advantage of other people, is honest with them, doesn't mislead them. There'll be a lot of temptations towards things which could interfere with you ultimately attaining happiness as a culinarian.
It's this thing about the life of money making is when they're taken under compulsion.
Yes.
I mean, like,
It doesn't mean somebody's holding a gun to your head.
No, I know, I'm not compelled to make money, but in order for me not to wither into my body eating its own fat, I have to make money.
Sure.
In order to eat.
Yeah.
And then, you know, and like it goes on to say some other things, and then it is just like so abrupt that, you know, and then with these things being said, let us leave the subject. And it's like,
Yeah. Well, what we have with Aristotle are a lot of sort of outlines.
Right. And then I guess also there's a lot that's left out because of translation. That
No, the translations are having things in there. They're just garbling them up.
well, yeah, that's I mean, you know, and the way that they are translated into English
Yeah.
language is.
As far as the issue about the life of money making, what he means there, he's not talking about whether you have to earn money or not. He's saying a life that's centered around money making. So
right.
the life of pleasure is a life that's fundamentally centered around pleasure. It doesn't mean it doesn't.
You get pleasure from making money. Is
Well, the life of money making would be you. That's all you're really about.
sure.
That's the central focus. And you know, really.
As is the health nut gets pleasure out of being
Exactly,
healthy.
yeah. They're losing sight of some of the other good
Right.
things.
Right.
Now, Aristotle thinks that some people are going to be forced to this. He's perfectly
Absolutely.
willing. And one of the blind spots in Aristotle that I do have to point out, he does think that most people that are involved with the crafts can't really live the full happy life, in part because they're mainly involved in trying to make money.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's the whole thing too, is like in our industry it says, you know, first one is to, you know, the property, second is to the guest, third is to, you know, whatever else it is, and fourth is to yourself, if that's even possible.
As far as like duties or
Yeah.
obligations. Yeah, well, we've actually talked quite a bit about this. The culinary industry, by its very nature, is very hard on people.
Yeah.
You know, and there's kind of this goes to that question too about, you know, where do you get your moral conceptions from? From your environment in large part. The culinary environment is constantly stressing. You have to fit in. You're part of, you know, this larger thing, and maybe doesn't actually allow you much chance to ask these questions about what are the purposes here. What am I actually trying to attain? Or allows that only as a luxury for once you attain sort of superstar status, right?
But then are they happy? I mean, you know.
The superstars?
I know that most of them aren't.
I suspect that a lot of the superstar chefs are actually motivated primarily by honor. Well,
I mean, that's just me personally.
yeah, but they're not looking to you individually for.
Well, yeah, but I mean, at a certain time I would think that they would be though. Because, like.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, who are we to say?
We define honor though as sort of a sense of notoriety, right? I mean,
Honor is other people looking up to you saying you're a good, you know,
Yeah.
good person in this sense or that sense, whether you are or not.
Yeah. No, yeah.
So these celebrity chefs, they do have honor in the sense that Aristotle's talking about. And I mean, he does point something out. Who do we want to be honored by? People who we actually care about.
Yeah.
You know?
Right, exactly, and I mean, that being said, at the same time, it's, you know, who, it's like, yeah, that's exactly right, is who are we looking for, you know, to be proud of, or for you to be proud of what you do?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So any other questions or issues? Yeah.
Do you think Aristotle asks more questions than he actually gives answers? And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but
Does he ask more questions than he gives answers?
in this
to?
specific,
I think he opens up questions, and then he considers a
that's,
bunch
yeah,
of
that's what I
different.
mean, more like opens up more.
Yeah, and then he considers a bunch of different people's answers to them, and he wants to see what's valuable in them and what's not. What I'd be willing to say is he leaves some questions open, and this goes to
Yeah.
your complaint about Aristotle, because he doesn't actually like go into great detail about stuff. Yeah, he leaves some things
He's
quite
kind
open.
of like a Native American storyteller, like he tells you the story, but he leaves you to make up the ending. He doesn't actually tell you.
No, I think he's more structured than that.
Maybe he has a pursuit for the truth.
Say again?
The truth.
Well, he is trying to pursue truth, yeah. Actually, Aristotle had a nice quip, he disagreed with his teacher Plato, who he studied with for 20 years, so he must have liked the guy, And he said at one point where he's disagreeing with Plato, well, we must love our friends, but we must love truth even more. Implying, well, Plato was wrong about this, so I'm going to have to go with truth. But truth is complex for Aristotle.
He looked on the particulars first and then tried to derive the ultimate truth from that, rather than looking from the point up above, like Plato.
That's the sort of textbook thing that they give you about that, but it's more complicated than that. Oftentimes you have to look to the universal and then look at particulars. There's sort of a back and forth. And Plato wasn't always just, looking at the universal. You have to work your way from the particular to the universal.
Because I guess we have no, actually equipment, we can't have that ability to look really universally, because there would be...
For Aristotle?
For us, human beings.
Oh, sure. He thinks we do. It just takes a lot of work, And we always do it within the context of our own life. So that's why he uses so many examples.
Thank you.
Thank you
Sure.
very much.
But in working at the example, the idea is to try to get to what's universal truth.
I found it interesting when he asked, is he born without a function?
You mean about human beings?
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of views of human beings that see us as
I think we function.
not having a function.
We function as whatever we want to function as.
Well, then that would be like purely individualistic.
Postmodernism, that would be. Maybe that would be a point of postmodernism.
You don't even have to go as far as postmodernism for that. Just traditional liberalism, not in the political sense, but in the philosophical sense. It begins from the idea that we have no common sort of structure that we can look at, no common function. We should just sort of figure it out on our own. It's one thing to say that there actually is something we aim at, and we each have to figure it out, but we're actually aiming at the same thing. It's another to say it's like totally up for grabs, and we all just kind of come up with our own interpretation. And yeah, postmodernism does do that, but you don't have to go as far as that. Jean-Paul Sartre is saying something like that, but saying that we create our own essence, each one of us. So yeah, but yeah, there are a lot of viewpoints that say, look, we really have nothing in common with each other. We can't talk about these overarching moral questions because we begin from disagreement and we can never reach any sort of agreement. If that's the case, then we're pretty much stuck.
Yeah.
And then it turns in, usually what happens then, and this is where postmodernism goes, it just turns into the play of power.
Oh, yes.
My interpretation dominates yours because I got the PhD and you don't. Where I'm in charge of the kitchen and you're not. Or, anything along those
Might
lines.
is the ethics, becomes the ethics.
Yeah, and I certainly don't want to go there. I don't think any of you do. I hope. If you do, then don't let me get stuck under you.
Wasn't ethics originally study of like what ought to be and moral, more of like what it is in like in different cultures and humans?
Well, again, that's one of those things that they say in textbooks, but ethics and morals are actually the same. Ethos is the Greek term, mores is the Latin term, and sometimes we contrast them. Some textbook writers have liked to say, well, there's moral codes, and those, are fact, those are just statements of fact, and then there's ethics is the study of what it ought to be, but somebody like Aristotle wouldn't recognize that distinction. That's a very late modern distinction. That's certainly not agreed on by all philosophers. Yeah. Any other questions? Or, yeah.
I think Aristotle kind of touched on the subject of like the human nature, like massive mankind are evidently quite slavish to their tastes, and like preferring a lifestyle suitable to beasts, and like the virtue, like the nature of man is quite the contrary of what we think is virtue. And
well, there's nature in a couple different senses.
yes,
There's nature in the sense of where things currently are. And you're right, he does think that the majority of people are making bad choices when it comes to evaluating which of these we ought to pursue. But that's not nature in the full sense. To actually develop virtue, for Aristotle, is to develop human nature. We have the capacity for virtue, for cultivating parts of ourselves that may just remain potential until we actually make them actual. And to do that is in a certain way to be more human than our starting point. So like he says with respect to the virtues, none of us are naturally courageous or just or have good tempers. We have the capacity, for example, to feel anger or the capacity to feel fear. And then we can act in certain ways towards it. And we don't already have the habit built up when we're born of managing our anger well or managing our fear well and acting the way we ought to. We have to develop that over time. But to do that, to acquire virtue, is to realize human nature. So there's nature in the sense of like our starting point, which is not very good, admittedly. And a lot of people just stay at the starting point, right? Or they even become worse. They become vicious. And then there's nature in the sense of what we're actually shooting for, what our goal ought to be.
He also says, what is peculiar to man?
Yeah.
And
Or human beings. Every time you see man, because of the sort of, it's translated by these people back in the time when that was fine to
I understand what
Yeah.
the man part, but when he says what is peculiar to man, it makes me think that he's asking like what's different about the human beings.
compared to other animals.
Right.
Yeah.
And to me is our ability to ask questions. I mean, animals don't question why things happen. They don't like thirst for knowledge. You just act on instinct.
Yeah, I've said this in other classes. A dog doesn't actually ask itself, "Am I a good dog?" You know.
Yeah.
Um,
He just obeys his master because.
well, a dog does raise certain questions for itself. It doesn't ask itself those questions, but it does, do things like, "What's that over there? Can I eat this? Let me try it."
Yeah.
But you're right. A lot of it is based on instinct.
They evaluate fairness, though.
Yeah, and actually, I had cats that could grasp the concept of punishment. The dominant cat started punishing the other cats when they got in trouble. She would go up to them, and, after we'd yelled at them or squirted them, she'd go up to them and pop them. So they can get some human concepts, but you're right. They don't ask questions about it. Dogs don't say, "What is fairness?"
Right.
But it's not just asking the questions. That is important. It's answering them.
Yeah.
Because if all you do is ask questions,
Means to an
You never get anything done. You never actually arrive at anything. But think about this in terms of culinary stuff. No other animals really do a lot of cooking. I mean, you can say that some of them do some things that modify the food that they're eating. And I'm not just talking about like, otters breaking open, the shells or things like that. Some do a few things that actually modify the taste of what they're doing. But none of them have culinary arts.
Right.
That's distinctive to human beings,
And then it seems like people do almost opposite. They don't go for their instincts. That's what usually gets them in trouble is they don't go.
Well, I mean, following our instincts can
Mhm.
get us in a lot of trouble.
Wouldn't there be a danger to, I guess, the idea of self-actualization?
If you just followed your instincts?
Yes.
Yeah, because our instincts usually tell us things like, hey, that person insulted me, let me go attack him.
Yeah.
Or they're awfully nice looking, let me see if I can, get in bed with them.
Mhm.
Or that looks appetizing,
Well,
let me eat as much of it as I can.
What I meant by getting us in trouble is like when a woman looks at a guy and, it's like, oh, well, he's probably trouble, but doesn't go with their instincts, just goes out with them anyways.
Yeah.
That's what I meant by a lot of people don't follow their instincts and that's.
Doesn't follow their conscience.
Yeah.
She's following one instinct, but ignoring another one, because, she has a desire to be in a relationship with him. But yeah, this is a total sidetrack issue, but I used to teach in a prison, maximum security prison. And I can tell you from like looking up the records of some of the guys that I used to teach, when you get that sort of, at the back of your neck, kind of hair standing up, you get a weird feeling about somebody, you ought to trust that.
Yeah.
Because there is something screwed up about them usually. And psychologists have actually borne this out with studies, that sociopaths do creep us out. You ought to follow, when you have that feeling that there's something off about that person, you ought to follow that feeling and not just say, well, I should give them just as much of a chance as everybody else.
Have you seen the movie, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo?
I haven't.
Well, the guy points out at the end of the movie, this guy sneaks into his house and he steals a knife from him in case he comes in there to like defend himself.
Mhm.
And then he gets out of the house before the owner of the house gets in.
Okay.
And he's hiding in the bushes, and then the guy sees him, and he suspects that, if he comes into the house, when the guy says, oh, well, come into the house, we'll have a drink and talk, I haven't seen you in a while, then once he's in there, and he ties the guy up, he says, why didn't you follow your instinct? Like, you knew that something
Yeah.
was up, me asking you, but he still went in anyways.
Yeah.
Like, why people don't. What?
I haven't seen it yet.
Did you see because there's two, like the
I
whole
saw the
series was
American
what we
version.
did?
Yeah, I didn't
Yeah.
see the other one. I
That's
heard
the first one though, right? In the
so.
series?
The
Yeah.
American version is it's not as graphic.
Oh,
That's
I
what I
heard it
heard.
was very graphic, but I didn't
Well,
hear
it's
which one.
Less graphic than the
Uh,
other one. Definitely.
yeah. Any other questions? Did we figure out the leg of lamb, Rachel? I feel like
not really. I don't know. I was kind of confused.
I feel like
The whole
I led us
Praxis-
astray.
The whole Praxis thing, I was just kind of confused with the definition of what it was.
Yeah. A big part of that is my fault though, right? Because we were focusing on judgment in the wrong way. And I think, I did mention that too when we were talking
Well,
about
judgment's a
this.
separate issue.
Right, but we were looking at, when it's the ability to taste wine and, sort of evaluate it well,
Yeah.
that we should have been focusing on to do it well, not, the evaluation piece, perhaps. But I think I led us astray in that conversation. Is it a little more clear to you now, though, the sort of idea of practice? Yeah, so you get a philosopher in the room and it makes sense, right?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think one of the questions was also, can you have both of them?
Ah,
At the same
Yeah.
time.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's what.
You can have some
Yeah.
things that are both and actually, there's two ways. You can have a case where a praxis takes in products, and then it's how you manage them. Like Aristotle uses household management as an example of that. You have all these things that are old-fashioned ways, being produced in the household, so it's all poesis. And then how do you manage them well? that's Praxis. And you can have cases where, yeah, you in the same action, depending on which way you look at it, it could be just production, or it could also be Praxis. One of the things I wanted to bring up that I forgot was an example, not from Aristotle, but by this guy, Yves Simon, who's a Aristotelian. And he's talking about playing the piano. And he's distinguishing between different ways in which we can use the piano. You can be like a great piano player. So that would be a matter of poesis. You're producing beautiful music, right? Because you have skill.
Yes.
Now, if you're doing that, and you're playing lots of happy music right next door with an apartment with thin walls to your neighbor who just had a death in the family, your skill is really great, but you're doing a bad thing, right? And so there's two different levels of evaluation. It's good skill, poesis. It's good what your product is being produced according to sort of the rules of the craft or whatever you want. And there may be a lot of sort of nuance to this where you can't quite put your finger on what it makes a good piano player. But you're using it for bad ends. You're not using it for the purposes of human life. You're actually being a jerk, right? That would be a case where the praxis is bad, the doing is bad. Or like, you cut up the leg of lamb really well, and then you cut it up really well just so that you can stick it to somebody else, to show them, I don't know, what culinarians must get into some sort of things like this.
One thing that we took from the Balud book that I showed you, the Letters to a Young Chef, and it seemed to resonate with everybody in the classroom, but when you were talking about sort of critique and criticism, he said praise in the kitchen is the absence of criticism. Yeah.
That's tough.
No, I know. But we all kind of latched onto it for various reasons, that idea of being able to relate to it. So it'll be interesting to see
That
how
would be
kind of
tough
bears
to live
out.
without positive praise as
Yeah.
reinforcement. Of course, we do that in academia too.
The praxis and the poesis thing yesterday, it made me think about when you were talking at the beginning of this discussion, the misconception with philosophy.
Oh yeah.
Because when I thought about it, I was like, well, you can't do anything without judging what you're doing to get the end result that you want. So it made me think of what you said, how people think of philosophy as just this endless cycle where there's nothing wrong, there's nothing right. Everything is basically,
Yeah.
the same.
One of the things I had to learn as a philosopher that had to do with my own moral development was how not to be driven into a rage after hearing that like time after time after time after time. And I got, after a while I got a handle on it. But yeah, they used to just drive me nuts. Because if that's the case, then why are we even talking in the first place?
Yeah.
It's all just opinions, and every opinion is just as good as anyone else, then let's all just shut up, because none of them mean anything.
I mean, like, the argument, like, we don't know if this chair is real or not, that thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there were philosophers who really exercised themselves quite a bit over that in the early part of the 20th century.
Or do you ever really touch anything?
Yeah, and then you look at their stuff and you're like, man, I'm going back to Aristotle, because at least he talked about something.
But like those other people, they might say this might be so, but they still hold on to different approximate meanings so they could function in life.
Yeah.
Like the one you've written on the board, that happiness, that kind of stuff.
David Hume was a famous skeptic philosopher, and he was kind of a great example because he compartmentalized things. He was the one who undermined the whole notion of cause and effect. Didn't really do it, but at least convinced a lot of people in Europe at the time. And then he said, this is fine while I'm in my study, but then as soon as I go in my billiards room, I just put this aside and I play pool.
Yes.
And think that when I do hit this ball, it will knock the other ball in the pocket.
When I was in the box of thinking that the cosmos is all there is, all that will be, and all that ever was,
Yeah.
it just ended up in there is no free will.
Oh, if you hold that position, that's the position that we call determinism. It becomes very difficult to avoid determinism.
You know, Andrew would probably really love St. Anselm.
Yeah?
We'll have to send some readings on that idea. Some of the other things that you've written as well make me think. Greg is sort of Greg is an expert on one particular sort of, philosopher, scholar, church doctor, right?
Yeah,
Bishop.
St. Anselm, yeah.
Yeah, Canterbury. And there's what is the Latin for it? The free will one that I just read? Libertate.
De Libertate Arbitrary, on the free
Yeah.
choice of the will.
I can forward that to you, because I think you might get a kick out of it. But we'll post some other philosophical readings too, just things on this, maybe a recommended reading list for starting off.
You know, another thing I could do is I
I was gonna ask.
I could post
Yeah.
stuff. Plato hated cookery.
He did, that, yeah.
I could post some stuff about that as well. He compared it to,
You got the trickery.
yeah.
Yeah.
Plato thought that I mean, he would probably be willing to call some of what culinary people are doing as medicine, like the
Yeah.
Jamie Oliver is doing,
Yeah.
right? And then all the putting tons of butter into things because it makes it taste good. He saw that as like being the equivalent of putting makeup on people to make them look attractive, even though they're not.
Yeah, I think Da Vinci had some kind of a similar idea as well. I think he
About cooking?
thought like food should taste what it should be.
Interesting.
taste like.
Fascinating.
I have
A real
not read
naturalist
anything by him.
sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense though when you look at like his studies of the form.
Oh yeah.
He was very interested in the naturalism and not all of the adornments.
Yeah.
So yeah, a beat should be a beat and nothing else. But.
Aristotle actually was reputed to enjoy fish dishes quite a lot. To have sort of a weakness for that, and to like to go to dinner parties too much.
Don't we all?
Well, not everybody. I mean, some of the ancient philosophers are kind of abstemious.